Chapter 231, Come Out with Honors. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. 24 days had been passed outside while in the internal space of the time and space spinal more than 2 months had passed. The practicing of body of the false god had been unprecedentedly smooth. It was perfect and beyond Zhang Yuoquan's expectation. In his last lifetime, Zhang Yuoquan never practiced the body of false god. After all, in the last lifetime, he had had no need to plunder the sacrifice power because his identity had been as a noble. It had been easy to obtain any resource he wanted. Zhang Yuoquan was ecstatic about his success. In order to practice the body of the false god, his martial soul had blended 63 drops of half-saint's blood and 3 blades of god habitat grass. His present martial soul surpassed that of completion of Heaven Realm warriors. When he released his martial soul, everything inside the royal palace emerged in his mind. It was so real. Unexpectedly, there are 4 myths of martial arts of the Heaven Realm. Sure enough, the royal family was not being superficial. Zhang Yuoquan could feel 4 strong breaths in the royal palace. They came from deep inside the Mount Emperor and were more powerful than that of the Yunwu Commandery Prince. He took back his martial soul. He didn't want to alarm the 4 myths of martial arts. Their spiritual power surpassed the 20th level and their perceptual skills were strong. If Zhang Yuoquan got too close to them, they might discover him. If now I control the spiritual chi of heaven and earth with my martial soul, 1 strike of weapon of thunderbolt will kill that heresy siren. Zhang Yuoquan sat cross-legged on the ground. The most powerful breath exuded from his body and a huge golden aura floated above his head. He was like a god sitting in the center of heaven and earth. A martial soul was the soul of a warrior. Now that Zhang Yuoquan's martial soul was stronger, his spiritual determination would be more powerful too. Zhang Yuoquan could now dominate an ordinary martial arts master of the earth stage with only a gaze, just by wielding his martial soul power. In fact, the body of the false god referred to his martial soul rather than his mortal body. When he received the martial soul, the strong breath which had wafted around outside him converged back into his body immediately, like tide water, and then disappeared. After withdrawing his strong momentum, Zhang Yuoquan appeared quite reserved. As long as he didn't release his martial soul intentionally, no one would perceive his changes. My martial cultivation has increased as expected. But to break the advanced stage of the Earth Realm I still need sacrifice power. Zhang Yuoquan stood up and left the internal space of time and space spinal. He headed towards the Jade Palace. The 9th prince has finished secluding himself for refining. 2 young maidservants rushed to tell Concubine Lin the news. Zhang Yuoquan arrived at Concubine Lin's room and greeted his mother. "How are you, Mum?" To his surprise, Huang Yanjun was boiling tea for Concubine Lin elegantly and sitting leisurely next to her. It looked like a beautiful picture. Zhang Yuoquan was amazed that senior sister apprentice Huang, who had such short fuse, could be so gentle and quiet. She was thoroughly showing the royal family's temperament. Huang Yanjun poured hot tea into a cup and then offered it to Zhang Yuoquan with 2 hands. He was astonished to see her being so gentle. He took the cup and sipped the tea. Swallowing the hot tea, he felt extremely comfortable. All his meridians and blood meridians opened thoroughly and his every pore breathed good tea. He closed his eyes and his mind became clear. He could feel the genuine chi in his body flowing more quickly. The tea's effect was not so good for a warrior, but to common people like Concubine Lin, this tea was more beneficial than any lucid mushroom or ginseng. Moreover, the mild efficacy of this tea was wonderful for an average person. If it was drank regularly, it could make him or her reach the Yellow Realm or prolong their lifespan. Huang Yanjun said melodiously with a smile, "I specially sent people to bring me back 15 kilograms of this tea, White River leaves. It will be enough for Concubine Lin for 10 years. Zhang Yuoquan put the cup on the table and said with a smile, "I didn't know that senior sister apprentice Huang was a master in tea ceremony before." "Why do you still call Yanjun as senior sister apprentice?" "Commandery Princess Yanjun is a gentle lady with a gorgeous face and aristocratic status. You are extremely lucky that she loves you. If you don't treat her well later, I will punish you," said Concubine Lin unhappily. Concubine Lin liked Huang Yanjun more and more each time she met with her. She thought she was a fairy, perfect as a jade and had no shortcomings. She sometimes thought she was dreaming to have such a beautiful and elegant daughter-in-law and then couldn't help smiling herself awake. Zhang Yuochen said, "Mother, let me reassure you that I have a good relationship with Commandery Princess Yanchen." Glancing at Zhang Yuochen, Huang Yanchen said softly to concubine Lin, "Shall I be going, Your Grace?" "Chen see Commandery Princess off." Concubine Lin glared at her son with unhappiness because of his bad manners. Zhang Yuochen stood up quickly and bowed to Huang Yanchen. "This way please, Your Majesty." Huang Yanchen arched her eyebrows at him and then left the room. When they had walked out of the Jade Palace, Zhang Yuochen said seriously, "Senior Sister Apprentice Huang, did you mean it?" Huang Yanchen stood in the snow wearing a white silk robe with a bordeaux red cloak. It made her fair face appear even more like crystal. Huang Yanchen stared at Zhang Yuochen with her two big royal blue eyes and said coldly, "Of course I meant it." "But we agreed that our engagement was fake," said Zhang Yuochen. He shook his head in confusion. "Zhang Yuochen, are you joking? I am the Commandery Princess of Cayenne's Yue Commandery. The same as you are the Prince of Yunwu Commandery. How could our engagement be fake?" said Huang Yanchen. She was serious too. Zhang Yuochen was speechless. He looked at Huang Yanchen for a moment, then said, "Senior Sister Apprentice, you shouldn't break your promise." Huang Yanchen raised her chin, exposing her white neck and said, "Did you fall in love with Juanmu Xingling? So you want to break off the engagement with me?" Zhang Yuochen shook his head and said, "It's got nothing to do with Senior Sister Apprentice Juanmu. If you don't like her, why did you say you were her boyfriend?" Huang Yanchen asked angrily. "You mean my other identity, Shen Yuo?" replied Zhang Yuochen. Huang Yanchen bit her lips tightly and said coldly, "I never knew she was so good at disguises. She even tried to seduce her sister's fiancé. She was never really my sister. But now she is an enemy." Looking at the serious expression on her face, Zhang Yuochen sighed. He had never expected this to happen. He intended to explain it, but realized that the more he explained, the more suspicious she was. He really didn't understand women. It was not incidental that he had died under Princess Kaoyao's hands in his last lifetime. Maybe he had hurt her somehow, so she finally killed him with a sword. But trying his best to think back, he couldn't find when he had offended Princess Kaoyao. Why do I spend so much time trying to figure out what they are thinking? He remembered Emperor Ming's advice, "Never divert your attention from martial arts practice." He pulled himself together. Zhang Yuochen didn't go back to the Jade Palace but instead towards the Imperial Ancestral Temple. Tomorrow there would be a ceremony of worship in the Imperial Ancestral Temple. It was natural to investigate here in advance. He was planning to capture the sacrifice power tomorrow. The Imperial Ancestral Temple had started to arrange the ceremony of worship half a month ago. On the ancient stone altar outside the temple piled millions of sheep and cattle oblations, including several savage beasts. Yunwu Commandery had a population of 100 million and treated martial arts as its fundament. They were preparing for a grand ceremony. Thousands of warriors, eunuchs, and maidservants were busying around the altar. They all greeted him as he entered the Imperial Ancestral Temple. Zhang Tangai spoke behind him. "Ninth brother, the ceremony of worship will be held tomorrow. Why are you here tonight?" Zhang Yuochen smiled and replied, "Seventh brother, why are you here?" In addition to Zhang Tangai was Han Ku. They had been walking side by side in the distance. Lin Shenyu followed them and bowed his waist. His eyes were gloomy and no one could figure out what he was thinking. All three were top martial artists. They left no footprints when they passed. Zhang Tangai said, "I will host the ceremony of worship this year following father's command. You should have opportunities like this when you get older." Gazing at Zhang Yuochen's face, Han Ku showed a curious expression. With a smile, she said, "I heard that the ninth prince's sword techniques are preeminent and that even the disciple of a half-saint, King Chai Bai, lost to you. Could you please show us your talent today?" Zhang Yuochen boasted a great reputation among the younger generation, especially his attainments in sword techniques and spiritual power. He ranked first among his peers. If his martial cultivation was high enough, the first genius title, which Zhang Tangai bore, would one day belong to Zhang Yuochen. As a sword technique master, Han Ku's sword technique was at the peak of sword following the Mind too. Her sword techniques ranked third among the young generation in the Omen Ridge's 36 commanderies. Of course, she wanted to challenge Zhang Yuochen's sword techniques. If she could defeat Zhang Yuochen, would it mean that her sword techniques were better than King Chai Bai's? Zhang Tangai practiced palm techniques mainly, rather than sword techniques. Even though he was first genius, he was not outstanding at sword techniques.